So welcome. I'm Hitoshi, chair of the Department of Architecture and Urban Design. So this is already the final lecture of the whole quarter. It's kind of amazing how fast the time passed by. And I encourage all of you to join us for our whole final review from December 9th to 13th, and we hope that the students will be ready. And of course, those who doesn't know which day, which lecture, and which review, please look for the schedule on our website. Also, let me just simply introduce our next lecture with Greg Howes, Principal of Idea Builder in Seattle. It will be held in the new year on Monday, January 6th, and we'll inaugurate the mini-series Culture of Ideas, organized by Greg May. These lectures will show how an engagement with popular and commercial culture combined with a specific critical vision yield not only culturally relevant design work, but more importantly, creative and innovative design. By focusing on contemporary issues of experience, technology, craft, urbanism, or commerce, the role of the architects is expanded and empowered in new ways. And we asked Greg to set a series of mini lecture series within a mini lecture, and then at the end of the year rumble, we'll have kind of concluding sort of a symposium. So this is a new method that we started, and I'm very much excited about this. So, but today we have a great. I'm very honored this evening to introduce Patrik Schumacher. Patrik is a partner at the Zaha Hadid Architects, and he joined in 1988 and has been the co-author of many key projects. The National Italian Museum of Art and Architecture of the 21st Century, together with Zaha Hadid, he built up Zaha Hadid Architects to become a 400-strong global architecture brand. Patrik Schumacher studied philosophy, mathematics, and architecture in Bonn, London, and Stuttgart. He completed his PhD at Institute of Cultural Science, Klagenfurt University. Sorry, maybe that's mispronunciation. Since 1996, he teaches at the AA Design Research Laboratory, which I visited, and they are producing incredible works. In 2010-12, he published 2 volumes of Autopoiesis of Architecture. The titles of Patrik lecture tonight is Organization, Articulation, and Simplification. Please welcome Patrik to the stage.
1, 2, 3. Thanks. Thank you very much for inviting me and for this introduction. It's my first time here, although I've been a few times in LA speaking. And I was also speaking on Friday night, and I wanted to start talking about this particular symposium, the politics of kinetism, to some extent to congratulate the organizers, because I think it's very important that this work a lot of us here are involved in with respect to upgrading architecture through new computational methodologies, with new sensibilities and new aesthetic agendas and values, is reflected with respect to its societal importance and its implications for progressing society and civilization, so in terms of more important general questions. And they need to be addressed because at the same time we need to become quite active in this because there's been a lot of skepticism, in particular from intellectual circles, about the depth and meaning of what we're trying to do. So that's why I took the opportunity to argue for the work, and I've always been doing this, but I think more of us need to become active promoters, defenders and explicators of the societal significance of parametricism. So I was talking about the historical pertinence of parametricism and going through a series of historical stages in the evolution of architecture, the discipline, and how they align with major socioeconomic eras and a kind of broad historical sweep, and then make the claim that parametricism is the only viable candidate for the epochal paradigm and style of the 21st century, which are characterized in terms of socioeconomic outlook as post-Fordist network society. So the particular argument they were then making, and have been heavily criticized for, and perhaps to some extent misunderstood, is that investigating the question whether there could be something like a free market urban order, and urbanism beyond planning. And that takes up the empirical reality that planning and planned urbanism, which got into its own the post-war eras in the 50s, 60s, 70s, has been heavily receding and nearly vanishing, and has been replaced by much more market-driven process of urbanization. It's something which, to some extent, is a reality we need to face and engage with. And so I've been showing this kind of summary image. You have, for instance, the era of Baroque city planning with a high level of order and ordering capacity of architecture through symmetry, proportion, and the completion of recognizable figures. That gave way to an era of industrialization, modernism, where we have much more degrees of freedom in architecture and urbanism, but still have ordering principles like orthogonality, seriality, zoning. And that went into crisis and has been in the late 70s and early 80s, has been replaced by this kind of much more market-driven urbanization and in terms of stylistic outlook, postmodernism and also deconstructivism as offering new degrees of freedom. So casting aside orthogonality, seriality, and having a kind of nearly open-ended agglomeration of form through collage processes. And that is, in a sense, the aestheticization of what happened out there in terms of urbanization, which I've been calling garbage spill urbanization. It's a kind of new degrees of freedom to have more versatility and repertoires to address the dynamisms and complexity of contemporary society, but paid for, in a sense, by the degeneration of a visual order, because there's less ordering principles, or actually the abandonment of all ordering principles, nearly in these styles. And my claim is, to some extent, that at the same time we've been developing tools and repertoires and sensibilities which wanted to re-inject forms of order into a built environment which should have maintain the same level of richness, complexity, variation, diversity, layeredness, like reality has somehow but visually undigested and now visually digested and compositionally ordered through parametric urbanism. And the question arises, are these visions realistic in any way? What would that require going back to a kind of state-sponsored urban planning imposing the single hand over large territories, or not? And so my answer to this question is twofold. That on the one hand, the kind of receding and absent kind of bureaucratic, state-sponsored planning, which used to be physical planning at the same time, where you have the rollout of infrastructure, state-sponsored, housing provisions, state-sponsored. So it was really physical planning, where the planning bureaus were applying the architects, and investment and design was in a sense state-driven. It's been replaced by market processes, where individual actors and entrepreneurs are set free. Yet what we find is that larger and larger sites in recent years have been integrated by private development corporations, and we have something like private planning. And we've been involved in serious master planning, where we can kind of try to impose within kind of certain sub-territories a new order which has that flexibility, dynamism, complexity, and richness which really we desire, but then made legible and tractable through parametric techniques of ordering. And so we've been pursuing these kind of urban agendas in different teaching arenas and in our office work, and we create these kind of quite dense, but intricately ordered urban textures with multiple subsystems, multiple audiences, but through gradients, through correlative and associative logics to generate kind of high degree of what I call complex variegated order. But on that scale, of a whole kind of city, or part of a city, again the question is that realistic? How could that happen? And by the way, this is obviously only a diagram which has by far too much homogeneity for our sensibilities still. So but we've been pushing these kind of approaches, and the question arises, how could any of this happen? And my answer to this is, so we have larger and larger parcels integrated through private planning, but beyond private planning, from parcel to parcel, and even within certain privately managed and monitored arrays, we need to reckon with multi-author contributions across time, with unpredictable replanning. And so the question is, can there nevertheless emerge something like an integral, legible, coherent urban order? And my answer to this at that point is that because I'm on the one hand promoting and buying into politically free market processes in the sense of allocation of land resources through private actors, I subscribe to this. I find a lot of rationality in there and trust that more than kind of bureaucratic political impositions. At the same time, I have that I find the kind of garbage spill visual chaos dysfunctional, not only because it goes against our aesthetic sensibilities, but it's also dysfunctional because it creates kind of, it hampers navigation, orientation, legibility. So I believe that to some extent what might become possible is a multi-author coherence, like in this project where we simulated at Yale with many different students operating individual projects into one overall cluster or urban segment, that if the epochal style of parametricism, or if parametricism becomes epochal and the global best practice with its a prioris of context sensitivity, with its heuristics of looking out for continuities and resonances, and with the universalized techniques of associative logics and subsystem correlation, then we could generate a complex urban environment which has this sense of order, continuity, and intricacy like natural environments. So if that would be impose or presuppose that parametricism becomes, let's say, the universally applied, shared global best practice, on a very abstract level of principle and heuristics, but with enormous amount of versatility and repertoire choice of how to establish connections, continuities, resonances, context, affiliations, sensitivities. And that would be very, very open-ended in a sense. Nevertheless, it could, like in nature, through endless forms and mechanisms, generate coherencies and in particular local identities, because what I also find is that this kind of garbage to urbanism, although it is in some objective sense differentiated and different in each part, once you have this kind of agglomeration of multiple unrelated events colliding together, you generate that kind of sameness everywhere, and that lack of identity which a lot of people find distracting and disorienting, and this kind of malaise and that criticism of ongoing urbanism. So that I would argue that what we can do with a universalized pragmatism is to, and the heuristics of context sensitivity, and to establish local identities in a kind of self-amplifying, path-dependent process of identity creations. And so I would argue that the sameness of principle would nevertheless grow unique and recognizable identities in different parts of the world and different parts of city contexts. So that was my argument. Broadly speaking, an article I want to point out in this book. You can follow that argument. It's also on my website, like all my writings. And most recently, also this book came out with an article which goes a bit more detail and connects quite a bit to what I will be talking about today here, particularly in the second half of the lecture, which is about the idea of pragmatic semiology and the design of information-rich environments. So the lecture I wanted to give here uses the three key categories: organization, articulation, signification, which are for me kind of the way one can break down that general agenda of architecture and all design disciplines, in fact, that to give form to function, and by function I mean in particular social function. Designers are in charge of social functionality, whereas technical functionality is business of engineering disciplines, and when I talk about function, I mean social function, functionality program. And how to give form to this, as a general task, can be broken down into these three subtasks. And the emphasis is on understanding these as forms of communication. So I would believe that the architect's core competency with respect to establishing social functionality of spaces is a lot about the communicative capacity of these spaces. And I understand spaces and design spaces as communications. I say architecture is communication, and all design is communication design. That includes also product design, furniture design, interior design, fashion design, very obviously graphic design. All spaces, environments and artifacts I consider from the designer's perspective essentially to be interfaces and frames of communication, and that's the way we should treat them. And the criteria of success of a design is therefore things like the information richness of the environment, the navigability, the legibility, and the predictability. What I mean by that is that a lot of things become visible and recognizable, but also you should be able to make inference about what is not yet in view, so about what is behind the immediately visible. And that can be delivered with the heuristics of pragmatism, I would argue. So the first example of what kind of spaces I'm talking about, it's not that that is an ideal solution to this, but it starts to address some of these issues of an information-rich environment is that a lot of things become simultaneously into view. So we're creating these kind of spaces where you have offerings below, above, all around, and layered into the depths of space. And that kind of, you confront it with a huge array of communicative offerings, if you like, and offerings for interaction. And there's this kind of immersive space, this deep space, I call it space of simultaneity, where in all directions there is things offered and to be approached, and with each step there's a kind of refreshing of the scene. And I compare that, the environment is therefore a kind of 3D, 360-degree all-around layered interface of communication and navigation, and you can compare it to the kind of screen in your pocket and the kind of amount of information per frame which is available here, that we see much higher. But it's important that we have these mobile phones in the pocket because they allow us to step out and remain also network-wise in touch, while we can now browse the urban environment more than ever before, so no longer have to sit at home in front of the telephone or PC. That's the way we look at these, and there's always, things in layered and depths of space below, above, all around available, and that moves is on the exterior and between buildings, and continues within interior spaces in buildings that have depths of vista. And there's also this idea that there's a coherent law of the field where you can orient. There's also the privileging of curvilinearity, which distinguishes the convex, concave, and allows us to identify units of interaction more easier and connect complex trajectories easier than as if they were broken up by corners and straights and angles, etc. And so this idea of depths of vistas and coherency of interior to exterior, of curvilinearity, goes through a lot of our projects. And requires that kind of making legible and digestible visually also implies that the richness and complexity of offerings within a project need to be brought under kind of ruthless formalism, so that laws and coherencies can be developed. For instance, that vertical circulation always happens where you move from laminal flows into crossing sets of lines. At that point, you expect crossing in vertical section, for instance. Just show more of these spaces which are about aggregating audiences, gathering audiences, which can have a simultaneity of vistas and across levels and from inside to outside. This is just gathering visual presences into a space. The next stage to that would be, though, to structure that multitude of offerings in ways that give order. I mean, this is a project I sometimes use to explain how the imposition of a formalism, which all the pragmatic necessities of a complex institution. This is a park and ride scheme with a car park, a bus station, and a tram station. How the different elements need to be brought and unified under certain formal principles to create an identity, a place, a navigable structure. So what is unusual here, for instance, there is this car park which actually has two segments of car park and is cut apart by a road, in the effort to unify that across the road, but also to tie and orient it in with the tram station, that route, so that park and ride is articulated. The cut of the tram appears here, another cut for the buses. So there's a kind of signature composition which becomes crisp, a strong identity, navigable, There are other things, so that that concrete surface becomes the roof and leads into the roof, but elements like these dashed lines tie in the dashed lines of the parking into the roof. There's also these dashed lines that curvature helps to draw together like in a magnetic field. The lampposts are treated in that kind of black-white graphics and participating with that logic of lines, and then the lampposts reoccur and bleed under the roof and become these columns, and the dashed lines become lighting in the roof. So there's a series of formalisms, unifying formalisms, which in a sense don't lose any of the complexity, but reduce complexity and make it visual, perceptually palpable and visually tractable. This is what I call articulation. And the disposition of the elements in space and their physical connection is the organization. But we have to move from organization to articulation to create what I call order, which always has that subjective cognitive element to it. And I think the next similarly operates here. We have an institution with multiple parts in the Montpellier project, and we use the elevation to express how the different parts come together, and we distinguish circulatory spaces, both in plan and sections, from occupation spaces. And then we have also two types of windows, because windows within that should not sever these volumes, but be distinguished from these kind of windows. And with this kind of reduced palette of circulation versus occupation, and with two types of windows, redundantly overcoding in a sense the difference between public circulation space and occupied space, we generate this this project as a kind of quasi-semological project. And then this purely sectional organization becomes visible, and you enter where a volume pulls out, and then one can kind of navigate that sectional flow and also stay connected to the outside through the windows. Here's another just quick example where we want to create a continuity of navigation space through a podium into a tower, and use kind of louvers as an articulatory and semiotic device, as well as direct spatial alignments to achieve that. This is a project, the Central Library Learning Center in Vienna, the economics campus, where Hitoshi has also a project starting here, that corner. I'm not focusing on that. But it's a kind of complex block, and you can see here that we're articulating two institutions. Everything articulated in black is the library, everything articulated in white is the student center, administrative center. So there's this kind of, and they'll need to have a lot of, let's say, interface surface between them. And we also have, like in the previous project, we have these cuts, which are more the public circulation and public spaces, which cut both in section and elevation and in plan through. There's obviously the projecting element. The major reading room announces itself as the ultimate destiny or point of desire, and right underneath one would enter. And you end up there looking out. And this is just showing this idea of the two institutions and the circulatory public cut, which also goes into the vertical and has natural light emphasizing it, and then secondary windows. Then you just step in under that cantilever, you encounter a kind of big orientation space, which is again that space of simultaneity where many things come into view, in all directions, and you also pulled along into deep vistas again. So it's a center, many different things should come to view. There's also a gathering space here. And as you move up, you have again this moment of below, above, all around, and layered into the depths of space with offerings and trajectories to follow. And then the kind of public space is guided by these skylights, which use natural light to guide you through. And the space has moments of containment, but it always pushes out and pulls out and draws you through. A bit like the Rome project as well, with every step the scene regenerates and you're drawn through and pulled along. You're never in a set piece in a closed space. And there are several of these voids. There's a primary void, a secondary void, and there are several tertiary voids which always open up the section and offer many choices to continue the trajectory, if you like. Point of criticism, the black, grey, dark grey, light blue has not continued. It is continued to some extent in the floor surfaces, where you have kind of purple carpet versus grey carpet. And then there's a distinction between the public space is hard surfaces, but it's a little too subtle for come out in these photographs. But you can navigate it when you move through the walk through. So briefly, secondary spaces. And again, the curvilinearity is very important to draw you through to every corner is potentially kind of breaking trajectory. So we privilege that. It calms down the scene visually. And some of those kind of tertiary voids with skylights. All the cores, by the way, which are vertical, where the lifts are located and staircases are all left in Fairfax concrete. So there's another material / color coding which allows you to identify where are the elevator cores in that project. Another thing which can be said is that the tilt, the overall tilt, which seems willful, yes, we love it. It dynamites the space, but it also gives the orientation to the front and to the exit and entrance, the campus. So you can always, if you're navigating, the tilt always pushes you back out, or you against the tilt you're moving in. So there's an orientation law you can follow. So everywhere that tilt is like a compass, it's showing the front versus the back of the building. Again, tertiary voids. And again, always from the outside back, from the inside back out, and you see the projection of the volume, so you know that you're one step below reaching that double height cantilever final reading room, let's say. That space, which orients you back over the whole campus and the park and the center. Okay. Next project is we just opened is this one in Baku, Azerbaijan. It's a cultural center, and it sticks out pretty much. It's kind of pure sculpture and strange form and shape. Draws attention to itself. It's a building which we had the chance also to develop a whole park and garden around it. The series of exterior space it has. Basically, it's a cultural center with 3 parts as a museum, so it's kind of as a library and a conference center. Each of them has a series of exterior spaces and secondary entrance, but in that gap is a primary entrance into a shared lobby. What is interesting is that the composition looks very different from each side, but also at the same time recognizably. Kind of in its metamorphosis, it remains identifiable. So this is one of the secondary exits and spaces. It's rather large. It's about 50,000 square meter overground accommodation. this may establish these continuities between of surfaces between roof and plazas, and because here there's also spill-out areas for instance, the conference center. Sometimes looks very solid, and from other views becomes very open and transparent. We always identify the three parts to some extent, the way they bleed together. This becomes rather high, up to 80 meters. This is the library part, and again there's this idea of slicing that envelope to make connection to light. Structure is a space frame with shell action, no columns, and so sometimes it comes back down, creates courtyards, just as a structural moment. But as we fill it up with floors, those floors are carried by column structures. And even though these kind of distant spaces in the tips of these volumes are visually connected across the levels to the general lobby, so you look up into the tip of the museum. These kind of deep layered vistas are of interest. And as you look back down from there, across the cascade of floors into the lobby area. And then between different parts, again, you get a lot of things. You get things above, things below. You look from inside to outside. The idea is to have formalisms operating again like the kind of tessellation lines, the steps, the lighting, accentuating and emphasizing the curvature, and kind of, in a sense, reduce complexity visually, which allows us to hold mentally and comprehend more complexity than as you would kind of allow the scene to clutter with all the different offerings. And this is the window into a courtyard. You look outside and you see the kind of structure or skin coming down, creating a forecourt. That conic cut into the courtyard. So it's also important here to have these vistas from the inside back to the outside. Courtyard itself. Looking back. Again from inside to outside, back to the building itself. You have those moments in Rome as well. And then this kind of cascade of terraces up into the library. Over many levels, but the final tall space is still connected visually to the lobby. It's beautiful when you see people on different levels moving up. So this is the space all the way up. Several levels still connected visually. And this is that top space, reaching up to 80 meters. Quite large exhibition space, if you like. And this is from one level below to that top space. And then looking back across the cascading floors to the lobby from the top space. There's also this kind of separate, totally enclosed room. Sometimes you need to close doors. That only happens 2 times in this conference center. And now we're moving to the auditorium area. and its lobbies, where you have these kind of slices which allow you to spill out into the secondary plaza. And so these are exits, the lobby of the auditorium, balconies of the auditorium for the conference and for the music hall. And then the music hall is a totally different environment. Suddenly again, it's with its own materiality. It's a closed space, but multi-level. And then it maintains a certain morphological formula. So you know you're still in the same project, you're still in the same world. And again, similarly, we use these kind of strips and peeling logics to articulate lighting, acoustic structuration, lighting gantries, seats, and also staircases. This is a project in Seoul, which also creates a kind of unified world. It's including a large exterior space, a park. The park moves through the building and on top of the building. It was a competition sketch. It's in fact a design center, exhibition center, meant to be for design, which includes also a design museum and design library. So this is the first part we developed with a series of sunken gardens and plazas with exhibition spaces. This is images which is not 100% finished. This building will open in March. This is already by now a kind of green tongue leading up to the entrance to the museum, and you can move through these wormholes to the building and all around the building, on top of the building. The shape addresses a complex site. In terms of skin, we're creating a totally unifying skin with aluminium panels. There's two manipulations. One is this kind of subdivision logic, which accentuates tighter curvature, so it gives more plasticity to the project, even if there's a kind of diffused light. And the other thing is perforations, which manage all the different openings and windows you need for some of these secondary spaces and office spaces. And rather than allowing this to kind of pollute and obfuscate, because it's no importance for the perception of the public, everything is hidden behind that unified skin, which is partly perforated. So only two cuts articulated the main entrance and the entrance to the museum. But what is quite interesting here is overhangs a sunken garden, -1 garden, which leads into retail areas. And it's important that the tessellation is kind of, which is always necessary, kind of organized in this way that it guides you through and pulls you through into these vortices. There's a big canopy museum. This is the big green tongue leading you into that cut for the museum. Some of the interiors which are underway. So the next kind of field project I want to show is the energy research center in Riyadh. We use this kind of hexagonal field. There's an environmental story. There's also a story of different parts: the offices, conference center, the library, religious space as well, and a lot of exterior spaces, all based on this hexagonal field, which is distorted and squeezed and expanded, and so you have variation in size and orientation. And it also structures the landscape where there's a lot of research activity and patches in a kind of structured landscape. It's very much environmentally oriented with very solid and closed skins, these courtyards which are oriented to the light and also to the air, and they're kind of staggered in height so that the air which breathes through here can capture the later ones behind as they rise up in height. There's also an application of photovoltaic cells on certain and not other areas, so there's again, accentuating. So what I'm talking about here is that we use technical differentiation modes, which also give then differentiation which becomes indexical or semiologically active, so it becomes articulatory layers. So the articulation patterns could on the one hand be invented, but more satisfying, they could be drawn from the tectonically and technically required and then clarified and heightened into some kind of tectonic language. Like we did with the tessellation, for instance, in the prior project, do it here with some of these courtyard and height distributions, fenestrations. And in the in-between space we have, again, hexagonal, but tensile structures, so that it becomes a kind of softness through the tensile anticlastic morphologies. So again, you can see this kind of ruthless formalism operating, which unifies, has its own differentiating logics, which allows us to operate gradients and make affiliations. Under construction. Again, oftentimes multi-level voids, communication and orientation hubs. The last one in this series is a big multi-building complex in Changsha. So we like a project like this where there's a large scale with multiple institutions, which also allows us to create exterior space between buildings and connection where landscape becomes connective tissue between buildings. So this is an opera house, a museum, and a multi-purpose hall, and potentially a commercial cluster as well. Let's click through quickly. Big overhang to draw you into a main entrance space, and that becomes a kind of multi-level orientation space at the same time, with views back into the in-between space into the other buildings. It's still in the main primary lobby of the opera house, which is several levels, and then the step into the opera is kind of, let's say, intensified and heightened version of our previous efforts, which also is meant to be electronically augmented. And then the museum, which is kind of organized around a primary atrium, which has a kind of orientation hub with vistas both into the different spaces on different levels and back to the exterior as well. And again, using natural light as orientation. There's another series of projects where we getting ourselves into something which I would claim to be a maturing of the morphologies through physics engines and structure morphologies, like, for instance, shell morphologies, where we use particle spring system and mass pixelization to have structural optimization, as well as shells and tensile structures, and then also using various techniques to articulate these shell surfaces, which I will show you, and to create fields and arrays of shells, nested shells, fusing shells. And what we like about shells is that they have this kind of convex, and on the inside the concave, and articulate a functional unity and unit of interaction quite crisply and neatly. And you can also see degrees of fusion in between units, but the original unit remains kind of visible and legible in these clusters. So these are morphologies which are constrained through structural logics, and of course we still have degrees of freedom with respect to other parameters. And then also the articulation of ribbing, for instance, and ribbing logics are algorithmically derived and performatively driven, but doesn't mean that we can't then utilize these, and that's what I call tectonic articulation. You use tectonic or technical differentiations and heighten these into semiotic articulatory systems so they become communicative. So larger shells have ribs, smaller shells are smooth, and then the kind of ribbing pattern gives character and identity to the spaces, and there could be different cases. And we could have different ways of articulating ribs and ribbing logics. For instance, like this, in the kind of dichotomy of rib and infill, or as cuts, or as creases, etc. So you build up in the structural options language of a grammar and language of different moods and modes and atmospheres. There's this kind of moment of the ornamental, but meant to be instrumentalized for characterizing space semiologically. Smooth versus articulated, and different articulations juxtaposed, and also degrees of festivity or importance can be, like you find in traditional architecture, distinguished and hierarchized through levels and degrees of articulation, but also through type of atmospheres and so on. But it's important that for me, that this is, of course, you could have arbitrary color coding or wallpapering of the spaces, but to utilize the underlying structure and maybe also environmental features like louvers and fenestration, which already give you a sense and some kind of inference possibility and a lawfulness, you can then kind of utilize if you select and bring them under kind of formalism. Then you let them do communicative work. This is a big airport project where we have these different shells which pull out into the arms on which the gates later push. But these different arms come together in an orientation space, which itself is a kind of shell structure but much more transparent. And there's a kind of receiving of different traffic infrastructures and drawing them into orientation space, and from there drawing them out into the different gates, and creating a kind of bright and well-structured space. Another of these shell projects, a villa, or another one, I don't want to go too much into detail, but there is a kind of desert project where the buildings are very close from one side in terms of the predominant wind and desert sandstorms come from one side, and then the other side is very much open, still the closed side. Oh, sorry, I have not more from that. So it's again an attempt to kind of integrate something into the landscape and articulate asymmetries of sight and develop a coherent project language. Now, I want to show that these kind of projects, which are competitions and real projects, are paralleled with, on the one hand, academic research, what we do with students, or it's kind of experimental projects like this one we did at SCIAC. They get into some tectonic morphologies, structural morphologies, and fabrication techniques. This was a kind of lightweight shell where we used fabric stretching across frames to create double curved shell segments, because the fabric was then bound with fiberglass and resin and then assembled. It's a little project, and the second project where we have and this is also about, this goes on lightness, so it's super light. Aluminum shell, which is origami pleated but with curved pleat lines, and using RoboFold built in terms of cutting and pleating of the segments. Again, there's a kind of technical expertise and a computational process. This is not a symmetrical mushroom shell, but every element is different because there's an overall asymmetry in there. This will challenge us, and these are these kind of segments we created with the cutting, scoring, and bending through robots. So these kind of projects, again, you can see that they seem ornate, they give character, but there's a kind of fabrication, assembly, material logic, which has potential to become a kind of characterizing feature, and rather than using only white plaster everywhere. And here again, you would gives a heightened plasticity. And play of light and so on. And we also showed in that, also the Biennale, student research. We showed precedents like Candela, Isla, current research with LeBlanc, and we showed some of our own shell-like projects. And this is one of our recent projects where we use tensile. And it gives particular, slightly, akin and similar to shells, but at the same time also different because everything is anti-plastic with zero Gaussian curvature. And that is a project I want to present, which has recently been opened in Hyde Park, and an extension of an existing building from the early 19th century, which we also took on and renovated. And as this kind of lightweight, light touch extension, feels like a pavilion, but it's a permanent building with a fully insulated roof and facade. But we worked very hard to maintain this kind of crispness and purity of that space. The rendering, and so the principle here is that we have an edge beam, which is without columns dipping down 3 times, and then rising 5 columns in the center. Steel columns, which at the same time are skylights, and then there is no further hard structure, but only a tailored tensile membrane, very tough and stiff one, tying this all together. These are the columns out of steel, welded steel, and then we created these fabrics. They were obviously form found through mesh relaxation, then tailored, sewn up in one single piece, brought to site. In fact, before the columns came in, the columns were launched in the gaps, and then we had the membrane raised, and then in different layers, the insulation layer separately suspended, and then an internal final layer. Brings in the light, and then the connection to the existing was just that kind of gap glazed over, and the exterior of the historical building becomes an interior wall. We then kind of clad that steel edge beam with fiberglass. You can see here, there's at one point from here to here, there's a full kind of cantilever which is assisted by that tensile. The glass, we made the effort to make it totally frameless, so there's no metal, and it is cantilevering off the ground and has no force connection to the roof. So it needs to also slide against the roof. You can see from 1 and 2 and the 3rd touch point. the view from the outside into the space. And that here. This is in the existing building, kind of reconstituted the original state, more or less, of the major walls, and a simple ring gallery space. And it's been active. It's very, very busy every day, and during freeze when we open, there was special events every month. Active hub in London. So that idea of well, we had been researching tensile structures with students in a number of studios, and then the idea came up to have a combination also of tensile and shell structures, and use tensile structures maybe not with columns or pylons, but combine it directly with shell structures, and then sweep off shell structures or fill out shell structures. So this is the Tokyo project, which is basically a big shell, which is made a skeletal shell, and then these open cells are filled in with tensile membranes and the central roof. So all of these segments are not in a single plane, so you can get an anticlastic shell in there, and then a big cable net over the roof. And now we're also discussing some of these are glazed areas to make these as well anticlastic, to become kind of cable net glass surfaces as well. Again, to bring more aspects of this project under one set of principles. The idea is also here to have a series of public spaces and a public path through that edge member, which is a kind of C-shaped truss. So it becomes a public path here, which could cross that territory without interfering with any of the operations. Here's the idea of that diagram. So you enter, or you take the trajectory through the edge. And the idea of closing that with a kind of fabric which pulls across the cable net. It's another of those kind of experimental structures for the Beijing Architecture Biennale, just this fall, and basically is working with Caramba and the idea of using finite element glass and for instance, extracting the principal stress lines off either a slab, or we then move quickly to the shells, as giving a kind of rib structure, for instance, to a plate. And again, the idea here is how do I give character, how do I articulate, but also in a larger space where you might have subdivisions, you might sense where's the direction of major span, where's the depths of ribs, etc. And the pattern of ribs give you orientation through the ceiling. So this is something where we generated a script into Grasshopper to extract that information and turn it into geometry. And you can apply that also to towers. You can apply beautiful patterns and skeletons. This is a pattern onto a hypershell. So we then took that idea and used it to create this pavilion, which is a kind of take on Candela's church, where he had 3 identical hypershells. We made them asymmetric, And he has connected them with these kind of crossbars at the tip. I mean, they have, each of them has only 2 supports. In the overall, there's only 3 supports. Each support carries 2 hypershells, but they need to be tied, and we create this wormhole tie as another variation to the Candela project. And we analyzed it, and then we had the decision that we kind of, obviously the stresses accumulate, so we had principal stress line as ribbing and grid shell rather than a neutral grid. I think more beautiful and more viable. And then instead of making the members differently thick, the accumulation of stresses we articulated through accumulating of layers of a unified, unidimensional bar. And we can also take the space off these layers a little bit, so maybe deviating a little bit from the structurally most efficient, but it was fabrication-wise more convenient, and also we like that sense of that expression which emerged through that layering of multiple these stress line patterns. And then we left a kind of color coding of the layers and brought it. It actually was more, we were thinking of the kind of grayscaling, and when we had these printouts of the color coding, the client said, no, I want these colors. So we ended them, but we were happy with those. And then we used lighting to accentuate and activate different patterns. Okay, so let's see where we are. I've lost my phone. How are we time? I'm starting in the final segment of the lecture, which is a little bit more theoretical. Oops. And some of the theories are in volume 2. Oops. And this goes on organization, articulation, and signification. And I'm saying that the societal function of architecture, that's the general premise from volume 1, is the innovative ordering and framing of communicative interaction. The architectural frames, the design setting spaces are themselves communications. They are communications that define, premise, and prime the communicative interactions that are expected to take place within the respectively framed territories. Each territory frame is embedded within a context and system of frames that can be understood and designed as a system of signification. That's the task, the overall task. And when I say a space of communication, it is kind of an invitation to enter, and when you enter, you need to kind of subject yourself to the rules of conduct. And since we have so many different types of communicative situations we could engage in socially, we need to kind of spread them out and distribute and order them in different spaces, so that for a particular specific communication to take place, we need to go to a particular place where like-minded and coordinated could gather, find each other, and put themselves in particular constellations so that a particular communication take place. With particular sets of furniture, and mostly also dress up for particular situations. So without that, you would have kind of chaos and no intricacy and differentiated specific communication take place. So that kind of ordering of that myriad sets of institutional situations is the primary function of the built environment. It's not so much anymore kind of keeping the rain out and kind of physical operations of shelter, but it's information processing, ordering, language, a general broadcast, and text, which structures all of interactions. So sometimes offer that thought experiment to really see what is the built environment that's structured and ordered, built environment really delivering. Imagine a large kind of city of 1 million or 2 million people and erase all the kind of built environment and strand people onto a kind of naked tarmac surface, you know that nothing could go on here, everybody would be lost, would know who they are, what to do, where, and what could take place. And if you strip them of other design elements, I mean, they would be all naked, then it's even worse. and there's really just blindness, as it were. So if you have that thought experience, you in return realize the kind of sedimented social order and as an informational and ordering substrate is required to establish and maintain society. So that architectural order has, I think, several subparts. It is organization, which is a kind of physical distribution and separation and connections through circular channels of physical bodies and places. Articulation is that task, and that we do. We do that organization task when we do these kind of bubble diagrams and layout. So that's in our domain of competency, but then the next step is to articulate that, to make it so that we do move from kind of diagrams to composition, let's say, so there's something kind of comprehensible perceptually, cognitively. But more than that, that will be the phenomenological part of articulation, but we also need to inscribe and develop a kind of coding system, which is a kind of semiological differentiation. And these are the kind of subtasks of establishing architectural order, which is required to maintain social order. So we have 3 projects, in a sense, in terms of the architect's projects, in terms of social functionality, distinguished from technical functionality. It's the organization project, the phenomenological project, and the semiological project. So organization, articulation, and signification. And I write them in these sizes because this is the one which is least understood. We do it intuitively all the time, and we make sure that our house doesn't look like an office building. The school doesn't look like a kind of power plant or something like that. And clients force us to be kind of aware of this, but it's not an explicit systematic project. The organization project is pretty clear. The phenomenological project is also not so clear. So these are the 2 dimensions which need upgrading in terms of architectural intelligence. The discipline needs to kind of invest in a kind of explicit intelligent enhancement, but even the organization project, I think, needs some kind of further enhancement because usually we have not many means of organization at hand. We know maybe a grid, that we can do an axis, and maybe that we can do a kind of nesting of boxes and boxes, but we very quickly run out of organizational tropes and means. So before I get to this, so we have this task dimension, the organizational project, the phenomenological project, and the semiological project. This is what I call the framing contribution. The organization project gives a kind of physical frame. It separates out the different activities so that they don't disturb each other, and that they have kind of enough physical space. Phenomenology project creates a kind of perceptual frame that I kind of recognize this unit of interaction, that building versus that building, or that space versus that space. I need to recognize a kind of entity without knowing maybe what takes place. I need to see what are the units of interaction for me to engage with, what becomes conspicuous, something needs to become legible. And but this is more interesting. It creates the communicative frame. It's not only saying here there is something conspicuous, but it tells me its character, social actors to be expected, the kind of behaviors to be solicited, and so they become social communications for physical bodies, for sentient beings, for socialized actors, in terms of understanding the users. So as we move from organizational to the semiological project, our understanding of the user becomes more complex and sophisticated, and also our understanding what we facilitate within the user. So organization, I mean, we need to upgrade, and I've been working on this a bit. We can use, for instance, set theory or network theory, graph theory to to upgrade our repertoire organizational means. I'm not going too much into it. There's a work affiliate which is operating in the organizational dimension. Accessibility and permeability maps, what really matters, they look all the same, but they're very, very different structuration of dependency chains with how spaces relate. These kind of things are organizational matters. And this also applies to grasping the brief and social relations, Venn diagrams, and not just simple nesting, which we know, but other more complex operations. Maybe introducing overlap, fuzziness, field conditions. There's this kind of interpretation of domains, where each domain is kind of bleeding. This is a new organizational mechanism, which is non-classical and only recently discovered, or fuzzy sets and blobs. These are all kind of means of organization we're talking about. And then the future become more sophisticated with using quantitative measures which give you a sense of qualitative operations. The work of Otto, for instance, minimal detour systems, and you can have these kind of charge comparing a series of types of networks with respect to total efficiency or correlating total network lengths with imposed detour factors, etc. But you can also characterize them politically in terms of hierarchy and position, equality of places, etc. So social charge and sociological charge, you can distinguish in these organizational patterns. Now the next topic is the phenomenological domain, which I've been studying a number of times and foregrounding in various student projects. It is something which I also use parametric phenomenology. It means when we're not only looking at object parameters, at geometry, like we do in organization, but we look at ambient parameters, light, reflection, etc. But also observer parameters. We have to worry about how things are perceived, in what sequences, with what kind of memory, with what kind of recognition potential. And we're looking at the user not as a physical body, but as a sentient cognitive being. So we need to worry how space is configured and recognized and understood. And we're using these kind of Gestalt grouping principle. We're saying so that these are not objective lines, but they're kind of implied or phenomenological lines or parent lines, which are relevant historical structure space. So proximity creates lines either vertically or horizontally. Similarity could come in. So here the lines, although the elements are closer here, there's a second character, similarity, which pulls these lines across now against the grain of proximity, if you like. And I mean, this happens all the time. You don't need kind of physically contiguous and integral bodies to present a space, a territory. There could be apparent, implied territorializations, and that becomes more and more important if you talk about these open, fluid fields where we don't really segment and separate physically, but we order phenomenologically. It becomes very important so that you can have simultaneously many things ordered, and you just need to kind of see again, and you can have Gestalt switches switching around the order of the territory. So smooth continuation, why we work with curvilinearity so much, but is privileging. For instance, if you look at this figure, how could we understand it? Usually we understand it as two intersecting lines, like this. Because we're privileging the continuity along that curvature. But you could also see it as two of these shapes. But the point is here, we're privileging smooth continuation. Like we're privileging proximity, or we're going by similarity, we're going by smooth continuity, and we're going by kind of closure. So this figure can be, usually we would say that this decomposed and understood like this, because we're going for closure. Closed lines are entities, units of interaction, but maybe it's also this, maybe it's two Ks or an M and a W. And if you would assume a little bit of a gap here, or you make a variable there, where the gap appears or disappears and becomes larger or smaller, you can flip the organization from this to this or to this. So you can kind of radically reconfigure the spatial order in the eye of the beholder through very, very minimal physical manipulation. You get the overturning of the order through observer parameters. And also you know all this about the kind of faces and vase, this kind of figure ground reversal. And we're going by symmetry here. Here we pick out the white and here we pick out the black, because we symmetry coheres figure and unit of interaction again. And we can use that. So all these principles we can use and keep in mind when we're trying to structure a scene, a complex scene, and how we want to decompose it, or we can try to do multiple decompositions and offer multiple orders at the same time. So this is this idea of symmetry, which is actually, I'm investigating. This is obviously asymmetric and amorphous, and it's very, very difficult to know where you are and what we're in front of. So the amorphous, once we create symmetry, creates a very, very strong figure and angle form. Because the improbability, I guess, of this symmetry. So, whereas if you have a cube, and the second cube next to it, it's trivially symmetrical. Also, I'm going to talk about this idea of figure-ground separation. So, a lot of the built environment starts to look like this, and if our scenes and compositions are very complex, many things can be temporarily read out and read into it. This is kind of interesting, that latency, but it also could be menacing if there's nothing coming forward and you're confronted with that kind of garbage film and visual chaos. Now, if I tell you that this is a Picasso woman with guitar, you might start seeing something in there, maybe not. If I put this next to it, it's another version, Picasso, and then you go from here to here, you can kind of start to see the guitar. And so this is something kind of priming. The observer parameter, if you bring somebody through a space to another space, you can kind of erode that order and it still will be phenologically there. And you can then other things happening, or you bring into one space people from one direction with a prehistory and primed, and you bring another set of audience from another direction. They would both see very different things, and you can control it to some extent in that space where they arrive as they move from here to here. Somebody else moves maybe from another image to here, which is latent in there. So we kind of work on some things like this, figure bleeding back into a field and crystallizing. There's other interesting effects you can use, which we use a lot in our exhibition design and so on, when you gradually move from light to grey. And you can, what is interesting here is that a lot of our perception of identity gets confused. This is all the same color. But through the background, it seems to be changing color through contrast. So this is the same dot. You have to watch out for these effects, and you can utilize and exploit these effects, both in grayscale and in color. So there's this context dependency, again, of the identity of object parameters, or whether something is the same or different, something categorically. Something is the same from one view in one context against one character and becomes different from another. And it's again observer perspectives, observer parameter reconfiguring the scene. And then there's also high level what kind of pre-expectation and figurations you bring to a picture. Is that a duck or a rabbit? And of course we have painterly efforts in cubism, which were picked up by Corbusier and Purism and even Michael Graves, where is exploring these kind of let's say object constitution being kind of subjective and precarious and unstable. So and that is again how we can imagine architectural composition to be reinterpreted and reread, and the decomposition or synthesis of objects, decomposition of the scene or synthesis of parts into objects is ambiguous. So, for instance, it seems to be like a simple story of a guitar on a table with a bottle. But of course, the guitar disappears when I realize there's a chair in the background. Maybe there's another chair, and there's a top plate on a pile of plates. And these kind of devices, which I initially want to read as tensioning devices, are to the top of a bottle. So that in the end, the guitar disappears. And something new emerges. But also this is the bottle, and this top of the glass together with this part of the book creates nearly a second bottle. So there's a kind of reassociation of stuff and fragments and pieces into units of interaction. But the scene and the units of interaction and entities and identities it presents is very important for us. And we go into an urban scene, and it's very similar, where everything is kind of frozen and we reassociate things mentally, and we don't in fact have a clear criterion of objecthood, like we would have with a car which moves against the background. In architecture, nothing moves against the background, so everything is kind of baked together. So what is one space versus another, one building versus another, becomes ambiguous. And depends on perspective, on priming, on prior experiences, on expectations, on perspectival positions. And this is another one of those artworks where you kind of, a series of fragments coheres into a strong figure and then disintegrates again. So we've worked on this, for instance, this cluster of towers, a project which looks very chaotic from the top and variously ordered from different sides. And I want to play this as one single animation, these towers bending from different directions with very different character and views. So here they seem to be all opening up at the top, and here they kind of opening up and become dense at the bottom, but it's the same cluster of towers looked at from different directions. So this is interesting as well. You have a kind of simple grid, and now I'm just rotating against the camera, so observer parameters change, and I'm moving to kind of a circle packing and into a wave pattern, or again circle pattern packing, and to a kind of wave pattern, if you like, just depending on how my view moves against that gridded surface. You have the other experiment where you start with seemingly an objective circle pattern, which becomes, as it tilts in perspective, becomes a simple grid or another way. So this shows that also not only is it about circle become square grid, but it's also in the different states, homogeneity transforms into radical differentiation and back into homogeneity. So it's even on a kind of topological sense, observer dependent. Even topology becomes observer dependent. So, yeah. Of differentiation into sameness. This one has also keeps reconfiguring into blobs or continuous wavelines, but also inducing apparent movement in the object. But it's actually observer who moves. So I have reconfiguration and apparent movement and activated by shift of camera. So they're called parametric figuration, reconfiguration through observers. So I can make a kinetic, reconfigure environments exploiting observer movement. This was shadow studies, but this is another way. These kind of different ceilings are all kind of reconfiguring as the camera moves across. There's also color change possibilities. Some of these louvers or palettes have color on one side and another color on the other side. You have these kind of ceilings keep changing color and so on. We're investing a lot of these kind of optical effects. But point here is also this, that the built environment and what we confront doesn't have, in fact, an objective organization. Everything is dependent on readings and mental decompositions. There's no one way of description, there are multiple ways of descriptions. And we are blinded to this to some extent because of designers. We have a particular will of building up the geometries, so setting a series of primitives and running a series of operations on them. That's not the only way. That kind of blinds us to the fact that it's ultimately very, very subjective. What's the compositional and constitution of units of interaction in a scene? So the final chapter, in terms of now moving from the phenomenology, and which is all about offering a kind of structuration of the right environment for perceptual tractability, perceptual palpability, legibility, cognitively, and now imbuing that with meaning and social meaning. And in order to do that, we need to kind of that prior work on perceptual tractability, because only what you can decipher, you can then also kind of start to understand and decipher its meaning. What you can decipher perceptually, if it's illegible to begin with, perceptually you can certainly not read off its meaning. So the thesis here is stepping back, that social order requires spatial order, that architecture provides a long-term social memory as necessary substrate of the evolution. So we're looking at this kind of contribution of architecture in ordering the social process, what I discussed earlier. And imagine we have only flat tarmac, all social order breaks down. But also a social order or a society, that means man, can only evolve out of the animal kingdom through the elaboration of artificial built environments. That makes society possible. So that is what distinguishes us. I mean, there's a flock of primates. They don't build up social order because with each generation they have no residue. They don't have the material substrate of evolution, which is a built environment which across generation can slowly build up a more complex order and structure larger groups and build them up. And they always fall back once again into a kind of state of nature. And so we need to, if we have a built environment, we can kind of separate out different activities, different social actors. We can differentiate the group, grow the group, and people remember who they are because they're going back to their part, their place. The different activities can be routinized because they can also be separated and take place in different patches. So that is ordering, but also there is this moment of not only people are in different places, in different spaces, but there's also that ornamental heightening marketing. There's not a single society which isn't using these kind of manipulations to differentiate the social body, to mark out social type, character mass, social roles, status groups, emphasizing the difference between male and female, young and old, different professions. And that has been, quite ruthless and rigorous and heavy, even all through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, where all these dress codes were very, very strict and had a very clear social structuring. And I think we still rely on this, although we have this individualism where everybody self-sorts and self-articulates into a kind of much more differentiated and fluid social world. We still need that. There's no way we could do without fashion systems, for instance. Society would also break down. But what I'm saying here is that this kind of morphological articulation, ornamental kind of, and it's instrumental, it's not making beautifying, it's semiological encoding, is also applied to the built environment. Because what the physical requirements differentiate, there might be tens of different sizes, so it's insufficient in terms of further differentiating social types. So you have that kind of ornamental marking of the built environment, endemic and universal through all cultures. And so architecture must speak. That was a slogan of the postmodernism. And during modernism, that seemed to have kind of bleached out a little bit, although it was there. Just society was relatively homogenized and through the kind of global consumption standard of mass reproduction. And then it came back, that idea of a semiology, in postmodernism, and in an abstract fashion also in deconstructivism. So curiously, that resurgence, or that kind of first time architectural semiology was brought in, it was kind of in the early 90s with kind of folding, and what became parameterism was initially kind of rejected. It was supposed to be, this was also not very effective what was happening here. We had the slogan from representation to performance. But I think social performativity relies on signification and representation. So I'm consciously bringing back that layer, but in ways which are more effective, I think, than postmodernism. Postmodernism had the problem that it was relying on these old historical motifs, and therefore was dependent on these cliches, which it recycled, and it was kind of not able to abstractly create new. Anyway, so I had that. In terms of the semiological articulation, there's various registers we could use to encode social meanings. In fact, positionality is one. You can say, you can just in the positionality, center to periphery, north versus south, you can have set up gradients, ordering gradients. So the meaning of the space might have to do with where it is already an information about its social meaning. The other one is obviously morphologically, the shape you give it. But further, color, materiality. So these are kind of registers, and they're kind of equifunctional. One can substitute the other. You can choose whether you differentiate by space first, or you use morphology to differentiate particular. That's still working. Maybe it's not out of I'm exhausted. Next point is that, so you have these registers. Okay, but rather than using color coding and arbitrary, you can use anything and turn it into a language. You have here this kind of acoustic system, but at the same time an ornamenting and characterizing system. Right? So I call that, using the technically necessary useful morphologies as medium of semiological articulation, I call that kind of tectonic articulation. I promote that. So the refoundation of architectural semiotics, I mean, what the problem was on the postmodernism, people like Jenks was also that tried to use the language of architecture was trying to talk about too many things, about mythologies and memories and historical affiliations and symbolism and all kind of things. That I think distracted and led this discourse astray. We need to radically restrain and constrain what the architecture is signified, what the architectural science speaks about. That's one aspect. The other one is to recognize what is the architectural science. Is it a column, a window, a motif? No. The full architectural communication must be a territory, a space, where one thing happens versus another thing in another space, what matters to us. So I think that's the first axiom, that the architectural science needs to be understood as a territory, similar to the full sentence is a communication and not an individual word. If I say dog, I don't know what I'm talking about, why I'm saying this. I need to make a full sentence. I need to create a territory to have a communication. But the other thing what I started earlier, you need to really constrain the domain of the signified. Architecture does not symbolize everything. It only tells us what to expect within its bounds or in its vicinity. So the territory is the sign. Its meaning is what to expect within it, what takes place there. The territory could be a whole site, or a whole building, or a room, so it has multiple skins. So what would we like the user to know about a territory? What can a territory communicate about itself? So it can communicate itself about what kind of social institution takes place. I call it function type. But it also might communicate who is to be expected, what kind of social type this space belongs to. These are informations you might want to know about a particular space. But you might also know where it is located in a matrix of spaces. So these are things which I pose as tasks for those who are designing systems of communication, the language that you should, these are kinds of information you should be able to read off an articulated space. Function type, social type, location type. Okay, what are function types? Function types are social situations, institutions, patterns of communication, individual interactions, like the lecture, which is quite different from a seminar, from a maybe a workshop, or a kind of individual learning like in a university campus situation versus an informal kind of space like the foyer. These are all different interaction types requiring different spaces, different constellations, different individual behaviors in order to emerge and come together, like these. So how in each of these the users orient relative to each other might differentiate them. And we try to kind of symbolize that, create a kind of language of articulation, and then aggregate them in fields on different scales. So how would you learn such a language? And I would say you just learn it by encountering it in its use. If an environment is systematically structured, where all the functional differences have morphological and positional registration references, and you sense and notice there's a coherency, you will pay attention and you will start to make these associations, and you will kind of learn by doing, as it were, like you would learn in any other language. So I'm not worried about that you need to kind of hand out dictionaries and have a kind of collaborate learning and deciphering. It's something you learn, and your knowledge and understanding of particular spatial language deepens with use, and those things you don't concern, you will never notice the correlations and so on. But the important thing is, again, that the territory is a fundamental unit of architectural communication. It's the minimal significant unit, like a sentence in verbal communication. So only a territory is a full communication. Something that calls for being either accepted or rejected, that's another aspect, which tells me it is a communication. Like every communication is either accepted or rejected. You kind of object, or you accept by following a conversation, by hooking on and linking up to a sentence. You accept the communication of the territory, you go into its ambit, you stay, but that means also you subject yourself to its rules, to its expectations, and you also read off the territory in advance the scenarios to be expected. That's what it means to know and understand the communication, that you can anticipate and know what is expected of you and what you can expect of others. And of course, you can, if you don't enter or you exit, then you reject that communication. So this is the kind of project where we tried to use shells to articulate a territory. And shells, I really liked about them that they make the unit of interaction quite viscerally legible through the kind of closure and convexivity. And you also know if you're in front of a surface, whether you're inside or outside of something, convex, concave. There's information in terms of the size of the space you're in front of. The kind of large radius gives you, on the outside gives you information about a large space on the inside. So there's more inference potential than with flat walls, already on a number of levels. And more legibility when you start clustering and aggregating. As you can see, you can fuse them, you can intersect them, you can cluster them. There's more tractability than in an orthogonal system. So an orthogonal system will very quickly degenerate into kind of visual chaos, where you maintain legibility in kind of shell aggregations, so privilege these, like as I was talking earlier about curvilinearity. And the next thing is that maybe, for instance, in the university campus, you have different schools and for instance, like the School of Science, the School of Arts, and the School of Humanities. All of them use shells that unifies the campus, but maybe there's faceted shells versus smooth shells versus creased shells. So you use this kind of morphology to distinguish these, and it could be consistently applied, and it has a lot of other degrees of freedom left. Then you could say you have different shapes of the footprint. It's how we build up a little language, a little grammar and semantics. A lecture hall might be triangular. Maybe it's to do with the focus onto a lecturer here, the big audience. Library might be quad, workshop might be patterns. Sometimes, to some extent, arbitrary, or you're systematizing upon what is semi-suggested by pragmatics. And these become now obviously freely combinable with this. You can have a lecture of science versus a lecture of arts versus a lecture of humanities, depending what kind of shell you mount over what kind of thing. So you have these 4 and 3, you already have 12 combinatory possibilities. And then there are different ways of articulating entrances. The next step would be structural ribbing, and that could take on a new meaning. So you could have different types to distinguish. They're all of them equally technically viable. You can have perforations upon them, but with different patterns. And again, they could acquire a different subsidiary meaning, which they require. So the sign, the final territory, is a kind of combined, complex sign with multiple layers to meaning. Like a sentence is a complex meaning aggregated of several words with different morphologies, and positionality might also be a factor. So this is important that we're talking about the combinatorics of complex signs or sign radicals, rather than just one register, just 5 colors, and you have only one thing to say, and you have only a manifold of 5. You get this kind of combinatorics logic where you proliferate quite quickly into very, very large articulated possibilities. But when it comes to these ribs and these shapes, you can still use now structural optimization logics, and the ribbing is driven from structural logics, and then systematize them into the semiological project. Because you have many, many different choices here. So you can always select those which fit best into your semiological project. And then I think also what I said earlier in terms of organizational aggregation, make that explicit. You have the shells, the nice possibility of nesting, aggregating, fusing, perhaps intersecting. You can do these Boolean operations, and you get kind of legibility of the clustering and nesting and connections and so on. So it's different types of, one dominates, there's an articulation, but on the ground no, let's say, obstacle or smooth continuation. So different, let's say, ordering processes you can maintain, and of course you can do them for all the different types of shells. Go on. Anyway, I don't want to go into all the details and show you that we then kind of cluster these shells, and when we now maybe have in-betweens or morphings between these, they might also be tractable between different categories, and you get something quite complex and rich. But imagine that somebody's kind of learned and grown into it, that every of these articulatory moves means something, and distinction in morphology represent distinction in social meaning. So that is a kind of project. Now I think the next stage, the final part of the lecture, is that I can kind of, I've been doing this kind of verbal overlay, telling you what these meanings are, and when you work on it, you have to kind of remember, you label, and describe, and have kind of text. You kind of talk too much, and it becomes a problem. To code, even remember as a designer all the different meaning variables you've been talking about. I think and you still kind of have less nuance than we would like to have in terms of variants and nuances and variations and quantitative variations of meaning. Events are not only workshops or non-workshops, they're kind of workshops with a certain character, size, intensity, which morphs nearly into lecture condition or into a kind of seminar condition at times. So how do we do that? How do we have this kind of more fluid representation of meaning within a model? And I would say it is that we can do that through agent-based modeling. We can bring the social process and the meaning layer, meaning what takes place in these places, and in situational communicative interaction patterns, which are the meanings of these spaces, into the model through crowd modeling. And I think that's the final part of this. And this is this kind of empty surface I was talking about earlier, but you see that there are demarcation lines and elements which structure the, and you always look for something to hook onto. But that is kind of something where situations and social patterns and constellations appear in space. And we use crowd models to install that meaning layer, let's say, and establish the signification relation, and I will explain that. First of all, crowds so far, I mean, there's been a lot of work on crowds. They come into architecture. We have them a lot in our projects, like airports, train stations, or for the sake of evacuation. I call them engineering crowds. They are evacuation focused, they are peak hour focused, and focused on physical throughput oftentimes. So they're engineering crowds, but they have to be generalized into what I call architectural crowd or functional crowds. So we need to, and by the way, I'm just showing, for instance, that in terms of the capacity of crowd simulation, there is a lot of work been done, and it becomes quite powerful in terms of the theory and the computational capacity of crowd. But I want to go here, I want to go to what has been called function crowd and start to model every type of interaction scenario, not just at the big evacuation and mass circulation, but when you settle down, when you interact, when you gather in the space, or and communicate and not just move between spaces. And there is research which is helpful intellectually as well as for certain tools in the game industry, because in terms of filling a game with actors and creatures requires a kind of intelligence of how to in fact simulate people in scenes. And we have research of functional crowds where there's interesting distinction between aleatoric, reactive, urbanistic, or scheduled actions and so on. So we want to work on this, and we want to create scenarios like this, scenes like this, and see how distribution of stand-up tables create clusters depending on where they are, how close they are, etc. And work on this. And it's an old dream of mine to do this. And we had a few years ago, we looked at responsive environments, and the environment might also change and reconfigure, how that reconfigures the social dynamic and the interaction pattern. So you have a dynamization of this. At that time, in the late 90s, when we did this, or let's say over 10 years ago, we didn't have agent-based yet. We had to kind of keyframe these scenarios, and that's kind of less powerful than doing this. This for me was the key, where you see that here, this agent, and there's a little flick from Miami, it's a Maya plugin, maybe for gaming design, that the figure changes behavior depending on the territory it kind of enters. Additionally, that territory is sliding and is kind of moving as well. I think that's kind of a seminal little flick for me, because that shows that as he moves from one surface to another, he changes behavior. So that change in surface means something, and has this encoded meaning, and it triggers a change in behavior, and that everybody who's crossing that threshold, moving from space A to B, changes behavior accordingly. Then I have installed a kind of generalized meaning of that, and I can So we started to work with students with these kind of agent-based modeling, and obviously, what are these blocks doing there? You'll realize now you find out what these blocks are. They're kind of ordering this group into 4 teams of 2, for instance, facing each other around that block. Don't know yet what they're really doing there, but that's the meaning of placing these blocks there. You can see here that you can script the agents with certain behaviors, destinies to attract us, but also recognition of other people, and the density which they gather might be situation dependent. And I think that what is that whole means the potential of an entrance. So of course they don't run into walls, but that's what is more important is that they also could react to more subtle distinctions, which really are semiotic rather than kind of, let's say, physical. An animal would also not run into the wall, but an animal would not stop at a certain color-coded threshold, right? But humans would. Topography, you can use kind of structure, navigate, and order a little bit the scene. And there could be differential biases in terms of moving up or down or on a horizontal line. I mean, this is just playing with a tool and recognizing that these agents obviously recognize elements in their environment and react accordingly. But again, this is more of a kind of physical avoidance, but I'm more interested in what happens now. The kind of, the socially learned behaviors tied on to situations. And what these tools deliver, obviously, that this again is just shows you that you can come up with all sorts of activities you feel you want to install, and the point here is that nothing happens in a vacuum. Whatever happens on these agents have multiple potential behaviors, and they're only triggered in certain spatial situations. When they come closer to an object, when they cross a threshold, when they're under a certain and not another ceiling on a certain, as they move from marble to carpet floors, etc. And just see that what you can, again, this is that a simple crowd, that there could also be things rippling and influencing, rippling and radiating through a crowd. You'll see that later, and again, it's not literally what happens here is of interest. But this might also, it might be something else, a kind of slow down or kind of becoming circumspect, radiating through a crowd, where what originally triggered might not even be in everybody's field of vision. I'm just stepping back a little bit and talking about agent-based modeling in general. It's a paradigm which is also now informing the social sciences. By the way, I just find that very fascinating. Computational sociology is something you could start to learn and look into, where they create little abstract societies, and social dynamics, interaction dynamics are kind of tracked and traced and simulated through agent-based modeling. And little kind of model societies are created. Now, this is something from my students at DRL. So, of course, you can do that on various abstractions. You don't have to have the character animated agents. You can initially just have dots or sticks or something, and use processing, very generic tools. But then as you zoom closer, I think that it's interesting and have more detail. It is interesting to have less abstract ones. These are still quite abstract. Now what happens here is that the crowd moves around and is ordered through this kind of differential behavior. I mean, once they touch and move into these blue circles, they kind of slow down and gather, and in the red they kind of slip and move. So there's a kind of structuration of the terrain with respect to behaviors, which ends up kind of coordinating and delivers a kind of ordered pattern. And there's nothing, all we do is we don't kind of establish a final result, we only establish the spatial order and the individual and the rules, and then we allow these things to run with, and have kind of pattern predictability without being able to obviously predict what individuals doing. They remain at degrees of even randomness and freedom, so these might not be 100%, there might be stochastic rules. So this is again a little flick where you can see that the demarcations matter, and as you cross here you kind of speed up and move away, so you will not recognize and be approachable in this territory, but you become much more approachable here, and you gather and so on. I think it's very typical when you, and that's the way we navigate space. You move in a public street, you kind of ignore each other, and you can walk past somebody. Depends always where you are. You sit on a park bench in the public, somebody sits next to you, you can ignore as if nobody is there. You step from this public street into kind of more private courtyard, you need to become more circumspect, you need to recognize other people, you slow down, somebody now sits next to you, you have to say hello and so on. So there's always place dependent, and we can start encoding this and giving these agents this differential behavior depending on where they are, and that means we're giving meaning to the places, because these places have kind of these relative to the rules given to the agents, these kind of impacts. This is again just simple degrees of speed in a kind of, this might be a market at the edge where you slow down, and in the center you move. You could imagine other things. This is extrapolating a bit further. What if people leave traces, and they not only follow each other, but they follow each other's traces, like in a kind of stigmergy? Could that be installed and help the structure? So it's not a fixed and given structure, but an emergent structure, which then has impact, a bit like kind of these paths which emerge in a kind of green in a university campus. You can have ideas like this, that the inscription or the semiological structuration of the space is in part, let's say, a result of past interactions. And of course, that logic has to be designed as well by the designer. So what the designer does, in a sense, create these kind of associative logics, or in a sense, for me, it's also been talking about subsystem correlations through associative logics in terms of all the different subsystems of the built environment. Topography correlated with circulation, with fabric, or structure with envelope, with spatial distribution. So this kind of scripting of subsystems, that logic is just extended to one more subsystem, to the subsystem of the crowds, the users themselves. So you script, for instance, furniture into a space according to swarm logics, and you now script the users into the space as one more subsystem. But what is interesting here is that we can do that with degrees of nuance. It's not only sitting, it's different types of sitting, which mean different demeanor, different pose for communicative type and atmosphere, right? And so again, I would have to speak a lot to characterize the particular way I want people to kind of relax and move and be attentive to each other, or different ways of walking I want and encode. You know, a kind of circumspect strolling, a kind of scheduled, fast, focused walk. I'm not sure how different these are, but you can develop different types of walking, and that depends on where you are and what socially is inscribed in a space. So I want to point out there's a kind of nth degree to which you give kind of the nuanced semiological encodings and build them into the model and experiment and test out hypotheses. What happens if one presumes these kind of logic inscriptions and languages to be operative? The other thing is that you can make the environment again kind of dependent on this. So there is spatial shell segments and correlated and associated swarm furniture, which again kind of, and then the next subsystem would be actors and agents roaming around relative to these and moving through different scenarios. So we can re-investigate also responsive environments and reconfiguration of environments, which could be scheduled by itself to offer different scenarios, which we then can test out with the agents, or also agent responsive, responsive to density of occupation, which triggers the reconfiguration, etc. So it becomes quite fascinating, because in terms of modeling of agents, the furniture and people are just treated in the same fashion, and the same could be with louvers and windows and doors. They all kind of become agents choreographed through associative or script-based dependency logics. These are all little tests. And I've been encouraging you make the scene. You bring more people in the scene. You run the scene longer. And I mean, with hard work, it's not easy to generate a meaningful pattern. You look for veracity. You would look also for innovation. You'd be trying out things. And I think what is interesting to me that you can read off what happens mentally, socially from the configuration of people, their behavior, their demeanor. So there's a lot of, I think you don't need to look into the minds of actors. This is enough for architectural purposes to structure social processes, I think. Again, there's this kind of study of configurations. It depends, obviously. If two figures come close to each other, this is very different from this. And then kind of experiments, scenarios, empirical observations, ideas. For instance, the idea here of a little lecture situation where only in the front you have a rigorous ordering of seats concentrating on the lecturer, and to the back it becomes more loose and bleeds into kind of loose configuration, and then there's a standard of coming and going, and the space articulates that as well with a threshold potentially. So you can invent different new institutions which are more kind of like parametrically variable event scenarios along the lines of how parametrism wants to understand functions rather than stereotypical conditions. And you can study that now in a kind of dynamic homeostasis with the coming and going and with and a kind of bleeding in and out of a crowd. So it's a kind of new institutional idea, a new unusual layout in space, and you can demonstrate and make tangible and also explicable to clients potentially, to yourself, what this might mean and whether this works. What otherwise would be kind of an abstract alien kind of proposal. And just the final kind of images, animations. Let's say how far we've gone with this. It's a kind of gallery scenario with different types of spaces, and the idea that different crowds, and also we can distinguish actors. There's the host, the gallerist, the collector versus the visitor. They all have different protocols and ways of reacting relative to each other and relative to the space. So it becomes also, that becomes possible and interesting. And you demarcate them now by different dress codes, which are also realistic. Usually you can see who's the artist, who's the collector, and that ties in with their behavior and correlates. So we can have and it matters that in the end you would say the ground relief, the ceiling differentiation, the territorial demarcations have all a kind of sense and meaning which you can explore as these meetings are operationalized in terms of the scripted agent behavior, which is individual, but then you can also test whether a kind of collective emergent recognizable pattern can be established. So you're not just kind of, there's a degree of veracity in terms of not just kind of draw that final event, but you need to get to that final event by focusing on individual free agents and rules. And that's precisely how events emerge. God is not placing us. We all independently to recognize, understand, and individually enter a communicative scenario, and then an overall scenario emerges if we have placed the space in the right position, gave it the right legibility and findability and navigability, and gave it the kind of right constellation, configuration, atmosphere, so that the specific desired situation is emerging. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm opening up for questions.
I just have one question, which is maybe more for the Lin students here. I wanted to ask you, in the last videos you showed sometimes there was literal motion in terms of furniture moving, and then there was a lot of phenomenal motion by guiding patterns on the floor or colors or anything like that. So maybe you could give a short statement on literal versus phenomenal motion and how that is seen in agent-based systems.
Yeah, I understand that Greg has been pushing the hypothesis that there should be kinetic elements in the space or a room moving around in it. And I think that's interesting and powerful. And for me, would be the question. It's not the thrill of seeing something move in space, but the point is obviously that with some aspects moving, I can kind of reconfigure and re-establish a new scenario potential in the space without having to rebuild everything. So that kind of switch over from one situation to another would be of interest for me in terms of mobile elements. That's the whole idea of having flexibility. You want to change the event pattern, the scenario, the purpose of the space, and that's where you reconfigure. And of course, the most powerful way of doing this would be the most minimal amount of physical effort to generate the maximal, maybe surprising and total, inverted commas, transformation of the space. And that is always possible if that physical shift is triggering a mental reconceptualization as well, and a new behavioral patterns. So I think that in this sense, we've worked on responsive environments and kinetic systems. It was always that kind of economizing on the physical movement and maximizing on the transformative outcome, as it were, and less about the actual spectacle of something moving. I think it's, although that if transformations and if an event is very fluid, then that might also occur. That something opens up and you see it open up and then slowly moving on. But it's more for me that looking at the different states a space can go through. And if there's, in the extreme case, nothing moves, but there's a kind of reconceptualization through maybe change of light or even through nothing. So that's, as you look, it's like this gestalt switch when you look at the picture and suddenly it switches from being two faces to being a vase. Then you have a kind of transformation which is totally in the observer and behaviors. And that is maybe the ultimate of efficiency on that respect. But I don't want to, you can only do so far and so much with that. So I think, yes, we will bring in the layers of ephemerality, and you know, we have a lot of kinetic elements in every building. We have doors, windows, light switches, partitions, and so on. And to orchestrate all this together now with the bodies in space, I think is of interest to me. So, and of course, I think what Greg is doing is, and you guys are doing, is in a sense a propedeutic, prior research, not yet so clear, I'm not sure, but with respect to the purposes, but just for the kinetic potential. But even there, I would look at for the kind of effect of surprise, because surprising transformation is the one which really changed something in ways which are super effective relative to the effort of change.
Thank you.
That was awesome. Thanks for coming, Patrick. Staggering production, and we all knew it was coming, and you sort of expect, you know, and have appetite for it. And it let's say the amount doesn't make anything worse, which is, you know, sometimes the case with some offices. And I think your office could also be the only office in the world that could probably, from this point on, not even say anything about their work and just have clients keep showing up. In other words, the argument's been made and so forth, and for you to, you know, I know you probably wouldn't say you're proselytizing. That's a word that interrogates implicitly a lot, and I want to get to that. For you to make arguments, and I think especially talk about the nature of communication is totally impressive, and I'm with you 100% that every architect needs to address that, because every architect unwittingly is engaged in this conversation, even if they don't talk about it. Your lecture reminds me, or I think of your lecture as a murder mystery, in which at the beginning of the movie, the murder occurs. And then by the end, you find the person who committed the murder, and they could be imprisoned for that, but no motive was ever found out. Blood was on the hands, but he or she didn't say why. Now the whole lecture spins off the premise, and and I get it, that society, which is us, but everybody outside this building, wants to live essentially in an urban world that's akin to nature, right? The level of complexity, variation, and so forth. I guess the point about that is that true, or is that your personal grand desire? In other words, is there a proven anthropology that you draw off of that you didn't invent as a perception? And there isn't. And so the whole lecture spins off of a kind of grand plan / perception for which you make the argument. How is it possible that you would preclude other grand plans? How could you argue against everything else about, I want to live in the jungle for a while, but then I want to be in an ocean. I want to be in a dump for a while, and a garbage dump, and then I want to live in a degree of visual coherence. How is it possible that you could actually include as much complexity as nature, which has, by the time you look at the whole scope, a degree of heterogeneity maybe that doesn't exist in the work? Sorry to go on so long, but it was just equal to the lecture, so...
I think thanks for this question, because it's an important point, maybe haven't been made explicit, but this lust for complexity, that wish to be in this, immerse themselves in this complex variegated order of a kind of dense, information-rich, communicative metropolis, is not something which is an anthropological constant or anthropologically founded. It is a kind of aspect of contemporary society is both for this network society and the requirement of staying productive within it. So what is contemporary society is like is the following. And first of all, it's very different from the previous era where we had long-term stable set of consumption standard and elements, the house, the car, the fridge, the TV, each with one channel or two channels, one car for everybody for 20 years. It was very, very simple, and it was kind of rationalization in terms of separating out the tasks and zoning out, and then specializing division of labor and each beavering away according to a kind of global, unchanging plan under instructions, so isolated in your little office, stamping these formulas, and somebody else on assembly line separated from another assembly line, and so on. Now it's very different. All of this is taking place through robots, which are reprogrammable. We now have much more faster cycles of innovation. We have a much more rich and complex sets of lifestyles with thousands more products, types of services, types of activities, and which are renewed all the time. So we're all working on projects rather than on beavering away routine work. We need to be, and we're working through communication. The physical stuff is taking place by robots. Only 1% of the Western population delivers all the foodstuffs, and those who work in agriculture actually reprogramming robotic tractors. And they need to stay in touch. So all work is now communication work. All problems are problems of communication. And we need to continuously stay in touch and be networked and recalibrate what we are doing, what everybody else is doing. So we cannot be isolated and beaver away in our little chamber. If we do that for a month or two, we're also running down empty corridors. So that's the conditioning. We live in a communication society, we live in a knowledge society, and we need to come close together. Yes, we use the internet, we use the phone and so on, but most of it is face-to-face. We travel more, we come together, and we need to be in touch. So we also have not this distinction between work and pleasure. We feel that we need to be in touch and be there and meet people and new people and participate and browse and make many different things, so that the next day we again make new people on a new trajectory, and our production is recalibrated. That is the condition we feel we need. We have the urge because we know that's the way we can be productive. And those who stay away from the provinces will be less productive, they're cut out and so on. These are objective aspects of productivity, and productivity is the ultimate Über-category, because only through that we progress. Productivity enhancing, productivity expansion, which in the end turns out with material plenty, which the new kind of invention, which needed a huge number of specialists and people to communicate, be brought in and consumers. So that is what I call contemporary network society. So and we internalize that objective requirement of being productive as a kind of urge, because we know we feel that if we don't participate, we're kind of cut off, we will be unsafe and unproductive and unwanted. And I think aesthetic sensibilities also grow with that. We kind of learn to, we are drawn to these hubs, these spaces. And to some extent you can say yes, and sometimes for a moment we want to get away from it all. And we go into a holiday where things will be different. But even on holidays, sometimes I have the feeling in the resorts you have bars and places and clubs, and retirement maybe is a moment where you can have that quietude and so on. But then again, when are we retiring? My father is over 80, he is still like this, and maybe in retirement he wants to still have social interaction. So to some extent, those who are in the midst of life and are active and productive, it becomes, let's say, the 21st century anthropological constant. With some exceptions, as I said, for moments of release and holiday, which are 1% of the time, or when you're beyond kind of 85 or something. And that's, I think, very, very important to grasp, the kind of, it's not just a taste, it's a taste for a reason. I think all aesthetic sensibilities and moral sensibilities are in the end functional for an overall social process which we socialize into not only cerebrally but kind of viscerally, emotionally, aesthetically.